Hi students, in this video we're going to cover completing the square. It's the third section of our unit 2 of polynomial functions. All right, so the steps for completing the square, you have to have a general form quadratic. And the steps are going to be if a is not equal to 1, you have to factor that a term out of the terms with x's. We're going to take half of the resulting b value, that value with x. You're going to square that value. And then 3, you're going to add and subtract that value in your quadratic equation. And 4, we're going to factor that into the form of a times x plus b over 2a squared plus c minus b over 2a. Oh, it's going to be b squared over, that should be 4a squared. And that's really just adding and subtracting some value that we'll see. It'll make more sense when we see an example. So for the first one, we have x squared minus 6x plus 4. Oh, okay, so since a is 1, you can skip step 1. You don't have to actually factor out anything. But then in step 2, we're going to take half of b, and b is -6. So half of -6 is -3. And then we're going to square that value and get -3 squared is 9. So we add and subtract that 9 in our quadratic function. It's always going to be that you add first and then you subtract. And then the next step, this part that I'm circling, always factors to be x and half of the number that you have squared. That should be x minus 3. My apologies. That should be x minus 3 squared minus 5. So the next step is always going to be whatever value you get right here. When you factor, is going to be x and that number squared. Now, in the example where a isn't 1, the first thing you have to do is factor the 4 out of the x terms. So when we factor 4 out of the x terms, we get 4 times x squared. And if you factor 4 out of 10, you get -5 over 2. The next thing that you need to do is take half of this term that I'm underlining. You need to take half of that term. So half of -5 halves is -5 fourths. And then you square that value. And that's going to give you 25 divided by 16. Your next step is that you want to add and subtract that value from both sides. You want to add and subtract that value. Mistake here. So when you add and subtract that, since you have 25 over 16 here, you're going to have to, when you take it out, you're going to have to multiply by 4. So that should be -1 minus 4 times 25 over 16. And then in our next step, we're going to have to actually keep that value in. So this should be -1 minus 100 over 16. And so your final answer would be 4 times x minus 5 fourths squared. I guess we can just make that 25 over 4. And then that will give us -29 over 4 as our final answer. So we're going to actually work some examples instead of just clicking through, starting now. So we need to write x squared plus 12x minus 11 in vertex form. So the first thing we need to do is pull out a if we have it, and we don't. So the next thing we're going to do is take half of b, which is 12, that equals 6. And then we're going to square that, and so we get 6 squared equals 36. So we're going to rewrite f of x to equal x squared plus 12x plus 36. This is what we're going to factor. And then we have a -36 plus, minus 11. So -36 minus 11. So what's inside the parentheses is always going to factor to be x and that number squared. So we get x plus 6 squared. And then -36 minus 11 is going to be -47. So in vertex form, we get x plus 6 squared minus 47. For number 2, we have x squared plus 7x minus 10. And we're going to do the exact same process. First, we're going to take half of b. So 1/2 times 7 is 7 divided by 2. And then we need to square that value. So we get 7 over 2 squared, which really means you square the numerator and square the denominator, and we get 49 over 4. And so we're going to then add that value and subtract it in our quadratic function. So we get x squared plus 7x plus 49 divided by 4. This part is what we're going to factor. Then we have minus 49 over 4 and minus 10. So again, what's inside the parentheses is always going to factor to be x and this value squared. So x plus 7 divided by 2 squared, and then minus, if you get a common denominator here, multiplying by 4 in the numerator and denominator, we're going to have 40 over 4 minus 49 over 4. So we get minus 89 over 4. And so your vertex is negative 7/2, negative 89 divided by 4. But the process is exactly the same. Take half of b, square that, add and subtract it to the equation, and then factor. So now we're moving on to examples where a is not equal to 1. And so we have a little bit more work to do. So for example 3, the first thing we need to do is take out a. So we get f of x equals, now we're going to take a 2 out from just our x terms. So we get 2 times x squared plus 8x. And then we're going to have, like way over here, our plus 15. So now we need to take half of this term. So we're going to get half of 8 equals 4. And then when we square that, we get 4 squared equals 16. So what we're going to do is rewrite this so that we get f of x equals 2 times x squared plus 8x plus 16. But now we need to subtract this value. But we have to worry about the 2 in the front. So whatever we subtract, so we really added 32 to this quadratic function. So we really need to subtract 32. So we're going to have minus 32 plus 15. And that's just because we multiply the 2 and the 16 to get the negative 32. So when we factor this, we're going to have 2. And again, what's inside the parentheses is always going to be x and that half of b term. So x plus 4 squared. And then negative 32 plus 15 is going to give us a minus 17. So in vertex form, we get 2 times x plus 4 squared minus 17. For our next example, we have to put 3x squared minus 4x minus 2 in vertex form. And again, the process is the same since a is not 1. The first thing we want to do is factor out our a term. So that's going to give us x squared minus 4/3 x. And then we're going to put a minus 2 over here. So next, we need to do half of negative 4/3, which is going to be negative 4/6, which is really negative 2/3. And then we want to square that value. So we get negative 2/3 squared is 4 divided by 9. So we're going to rewrite this, and we're going to have f of x equals 3 times x squared minus 4/3 x. And then we're going to add 4/9. But now we have to combine something with that negative 2, and that's going to be 3 times 4/9. So up here we can just say 3 times 4/9 is 4/3. So what we're really subtracting is 4/3. So our factored thing in vertex form is going to be 3 times x squared. And again, you always get this value. So, not x squared, my apologies. We don't need x squared. It should be x minus 2/3 squared. So x minus 2/3 squared, and negative 4/3 minus 2 is negative 4/3 minus 6/3, so minus 10/3. So if you go and do the vertex, the x equals negative b divided by 2a, you will get the same thing that we do here. It's just that completing a square is a necessary skill and something that you will see on a test. All right, so that concludes our video on completing the square. We take half. So first you factor out the a term, then you take half of the b term, you square that, you add and subtract it, and you may have to multiply that value by the a term in the front, and then you factor. Thanks for watching.